On a chilly autumn morning in late September 2015, the small town of Westbridge, nestled deep in the heart of New England, awoke to a scandal that would forever tarnish its serene facade. The picturesque town, known for its cobblestone streets, centuries-old churches, and close-knit community, had never been a place of crime or controversy. But all that changed when whispers began circulating about a Catholic priest involved in an illicit affair with a married woman. Father Samuel Donovan, the priest at St. Mary's Catholic Church, had always been a revered figure in the town. Known for his warm demeanor and unwavering dedication to his parishioners, he had been the spiritual guide for Westbridge for over a decade. At 42, with his salt and pepper hair and kind eyes, he was the epitome of a devoted priest. But beneath this saintly exterior lay a man struggling with desires he could no longer suppress. Sarah Mitchell, a 35-year-old mother of two and wife of local businessman David Mitchell, had been a regular attendee at St. Mary's. Her involvement with the church went beyond mere attendance. She was a member of the church choir, led charity drives, and was often seen helping Father Donovan with community events. To the outside world, she was a devoted Catholic woman, but inside, she was battling a loneliness that her marriage to David could not fill. David, a successful but often absent husband, spent most of his time traveling for work. As Sarah found herself increasingly alone, she began seeking solace in the church, where she and Father Donovan developed a close bond. What started as innocent conversations about faith and life slowly turned into something far more dangerous. It was on the night of October 10th, 2015, when the boundaries were first crossed. The parish had just hosted a successful fundraiser, and the church hall was emptying out. Sarah, staying behind to help clean up, found herself alone with Father Donovan. The two had shared countless moments before, but that night, something felt different. As they talked, their hands brushed against each other, and suddenly, the air was thick with unspoken tension. Father Donovan, normally composed and reserved, felt a surge of emotions he hadn't experienced in years. They stood in silence for what felt like an eternity before he finally leaned in and kissed her. The kiss was the beginning of a torrid affair that would unfold over the next several months. What had started as stolen moments in the church quickly escalated into secret rendezvous at motels on the outskirts of town. The thrill of the forbidden kept them coming back, even as guilt gnawed at both of them. Father Donovan struggled with the duality of his life. By day, he was a man of God, and by night, he was breaking every vow he had ever taken. Sarah, too, was conflicted. She loved her children and, in her own way, still cared for David, but the passion she felt with Father Donovan was unlike anything she had ever known. As the affair continued, Sarah became increasingly reckless, missing choir practice and neglecting her duties at home. Her behavior did not go unnoticed by the townsfolk, who began to gossip. The first to suspect something was amiss was Mary O'Connell, a devout churchgoer and close friend of Sarah's. Mary had noticed the subtle changes in Sarah's demeanor and had once even seen her leaving the rectory late at night. Concerned, Mary decided to confront Sarah, but the latter brushed it off, claiming she was merely helping Father Donovan with church matters. But Mary wasn't convinced, and soon she began to keep a closer eye on the two. By December 2015, the affair had become impossible to conceal. Rumors began spreading through the town like wildfire. David, still unaware of his wife's infidelity, was informed by a concerned neighbor who had seen Sarah and Father Donovan entering a motel together. Enraged and humiliated, David confronted Sarah, but she denied everything, calling the accusations absurd. However, the seed of doubt had been planted, and David could not let it go. As the new year of 2016 dawned, tensions were running high. Father Donovan, aware that their secret was unraveling, began to distance himself from Sarah, fearing the consequences of their actions. But Sarah, blinded by her emotions, refused to let go. She would show up at the rectory unannounced, pleading with him not to abandon her. Father Donovan, torn between his duty and his desire, tried to end the affair, but each time he did, he found himself drawn back to her. Then, on the night of February 14th, 2016, Valentine's Day, their affair took a dark and irreversible turn. David, who had become increasingly suspicious and paranoid, decided to follow Sarah. That evening, Sarah had told him she was going to visit a friend, but David knew better. He trailed her car as she drove to the outskirts of town, eventually pulling into the parking lot of a secluded motel. What happened next remains a mystery, but what is known is that David burst into the motel room where he found his wife in the arms of Father Donovan. In the ensuing confrontation, tempers flared and words quickly turned to violence. A struggle ensued, and in the heat of the moment, David grabbed a heavy object, a lamp perhaps, and struck Father Donovan across the head. The blow was fatal. Sarah screamed as Father Donovan's lifeless body crumpled to the floor. The room descended into chaos as David, realizing what he had done, fled the scene in a panic, leaving Sarah alone with the corpse of her lover. She sat there, trembling, staring at the man she had loved, now dead because of their forbidden passion. The reality of their situation crashed down on her, and she knew there was no going back. She had to act quickly, but what could she do? The life she had known was over, and the scandal that would erupt from this tragedy would destroy not just her, but everyone involved. As Sarah sat in that motel room, time seemed to stand still, but the clock was ticking, and the decisions she made in those next few hours would determine the course of the rest of her life. How could she possibly explain what had happened? Who could she turn to? And most importantly, could she ever escape the consequences of her actions? The night of February 14th, 2016 was one that Sarah Mitchell would never forget. As she sat in the dimly lit motel room, the weight of her situation bore down on her with a suffocating intensity. The lifeless body of Father Samuel Donovan lay at her feet, blood pooling on the cheap carpet. Every second that passed felt like an eternity, her mind racing to comprehend the irreversible act that had just occurred. She knew she had to act quickly, but panic clouded her judgment. The motel room, once a clandestine refuge for her and Father Donovan, had now become a crime scene. The first thought that flashed through her mind was to call 911 to report what had happened, but as her fingers hovered over her phone, she hesitated. The implications of that call were too terrifying to contemplate. Her affair with Father Donovan would be exposed, her children would lose their mother to scandal and imprisonment, and the life she had built in Westbridge would be shattered beyond repair. Desperate, Sarah dialed the only person she could think of, her best friend, Rachel. It was now past midnight, and when Rachel answered the phone, groggy and confused, Sarah's voice was barely a whisper as she pleaded for help. Rachel, alarmed by the hysteria in Sarah's voice, agreed to come to the motel, though she had no idea what awaited her. When Rachel arrived, the scene that greeted her was beyond anything she could have imagined. The shock of seeing Father Donovan's body and the frantic state of her friend left her momentarily paralyzed. But Sarah, her eyes wide with desperation, begged her to help clean up the mess, insisting that they couldn't let anyone know what had happened. Together, the two women hastily concocted a plan. They would move Father Donovan's body and make it look as though he had disappeared, a victim of a tragic accident far from town. They hoped that if they acted quickly, they could cover up the affair and avoid a scandal that would ruin both of their lives. The two women wrapped the priest's body in a motel bedspread and carried it to Sarah's car under the cover of darkness. They drove to a remote area near the edge of town, a wooded stretch of land that was seldom visited, even by locals. In their panic, they dug a shallow grave, burying Father Donovan and covering the site as best they could in the dead of night. Exhausted and terrified, Sarah and Rachel made a pact. They would never speak of what had happened, and they would live their lives as though none of it had ever occurred. They believed that as long as they maintained their silence, they could escape the consequences of their actions. But as they drove back to town, the reality of what they had done began to sink in. Sarah, who had once been a respected member of the community, was now a murderer, and Rachel, her loyal friend, was an accomplice. Their lives were forever changed, and there would be no escaping the guilt that would haunt them. The following days were a blur. Sarah avoided everyone, including her children, barely able to look them in the eye. She claimed to be ill, confining herself to her bedroom, where she replayed the events of that night over and over in her mind. She couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, and couldn't shake the image of Father Donovan's lifeless eyes from her memory. Meanwhile, David Mitchell, still reeling from the discovery of his wife's affair, had gone into hiding. After fleeing the motel that night, he had driven aimlessly for hours, consumed by a mixture of rage, guilt, and fear. He knew he had to turn himself in, but the shame of what he had done was too great. In a state of despair, he checked into a hotel miles away from Westbridge, using a false name and hoping to disappear from the world, at least for a while. But Westbridge was not a place where people could simply vanish without a trace. When Father Donovan failed to show up for Sunday Mass the following day, the congregation grew concerned. The priest was always punctual, and his absence was immediately noticed. Calls to the rectory went unanswered, and soon the entire town was buzzing with speculation. The police were called, and an investigation was launched into Father Donovan's disappearance. The last person to see him alive, according to church records, was Sarah Mitchell, who had been helping him clean up after the fundraiser. When questioned by the police, Sarah played the role of a grieving parishioner, expressing her concern for Father Donovan and offering no indication of her involvement in his disappearance. But the pressure was mounting. The townsfolk, already suspicious of the close relationship between Sarah and the priest, began to whisper about the possibility of an affair. Rumors swirled that David Mitchell had discovered the affair and that something terrible had happened. As the days passed, those rumors grew more sinister, and the town's curiosity turned into a full-blown witch hunt. Rachel, struggling with her own guilt, urged Sarah to come forward, to confess what had happened. But Sarah was adamant that they had to stick to their story. The fear of losing her children and the shame of her affair being exposed were too much for her to bear. She insisted that they would both go to jail if the truth came out, and so, despite Rachel's protests, they continued with their charade. However, the burden of their secret was taking its toll. Sarah's erratic behavior did not go unnoticed by those around her. Her children, confused and scared by their mother's sudden withdrawal, began to act out. Her neighbors, who had once admired her for her dedication to the church, now regarded her with suspicion. And the police, who had initially considered Father Donovan's disappearance a tragic accident, began to entertain darker theories. As the investigation dragged on, the police uncovered inconsistencies in Sarah's story. Phone records showed that she had made a call from the motel that night, a detail she had conveniently left out during her initial interview. Moreover, surveillance footage from a nearby gas station captured her car leaving the motel in the early hours of the morning, a damning piece of evidence that contradicted her alibi. By late February, the police had enough circumstantial evidence to bring Sarah in for further questioning. The pressure on her was immense, and under the intense scrutiny of the investigators, her composure began to crack. Faced with the mounting evidence, Sarah finally broke down and confessed to the affair, but she adamantly denied any involvement in Father Donovan's death. Despite her confession, the police were convinced that Sarah knew more than she was letting on. They began to piece together a timeline of events, theorizing that David Mitchell had confronted the couple at the motel and that, in the ensuing struggle, Father Donovan had been killed. But without a body, their case remained weak, and the search for Father Donovan continued. As March 2016 arrived, the snow began to melt, revealing the grim reality that Sarah and Rachel had tried so hard to conceal. A hiker, walking his dog in the woods near the edge of town, stumbled upon a patch of disturbed earth. When he began to investigate further, he uncovered the shallow grave where Father Donovan had been buried. The police were called, and within hours, the town of Westbridge was plunged into shock. The discovery of the body confirmed the worst fears of the investigators. Father Donovan had been murdered, and the evidence pointed squarely at Sarah Mitchell and her husband, David. The media descended upon Westbridge, turning the once quiet town into a circus of flashing cameras and probing questions. The scandal that Sarah had tried so desperately to avoid was now playing out on the national stage. With the body recovered, the police intensified their search for David Mitchell, who was still on the run. They issued a warrant for his arrest, charging him with the murder of Father Donovan. Sarah, now under constant surveillance, was arrested as an accessory to murder, her once respectable life in ruins. As the town of Westbridge grappled with the fallout of the scandal, the focus shifted to finding David and bringing him to justice. But with each passing day, the chances of locating him seemed to grow slimmer. The manhunt spanned multiple states, and as the weeks turned into months, the question on everyone's mind was the same. Would David Mitchell ever be found, and would justice ever be served for the murder of Father Samuel Donovan? Spring arrived in Westbridge with an uneasy calm. The blossoms on the trees and the chirping of birds, a stark contrast to the undercurrent of dread that still lingered in the town. The discovery of Father Donovan's body had sent shockwaves through the community, and with David Mitchell still at large, fear hung in the air like a thick fog. The once idyllic town had become a place of whispered conversations, sideways glances, and an unspoken understanding that nothing would ever be the same. The search for David Mitchell had turned into a nationwide manhunt. His face was plastered on every news channel, his name spoken in hushed tones by those who had once considered him a neighbor, a friend. Tips poured in from all corners of the country, sightings that led investigators on a wild chase from state to state. But David remained elusive, slipping through their fingers time and again. Meanwhile, Sarah Mitchell sat in a cold, gray cell, awaiting trial. The woman who had once been the pride of St. Mary's, a devoted mother and wife, was now the center of a scandal that had rocked the very foundations of Westbridge. Her confession to the affair had already damned her in the eyes of the public, but her involvement in the cover-up of Father Donovan's murder left little room for sympathy. Her trial was set for June 2016, and as the date approached, the media frenzy only intensified. Rachel, too, faced her day in court. Though she had not been involved in the actual killing, her role in helping Sarah bury Father Donovan's body made her an accessory after the fact. She had turned herself in after the body was discovered, overwhelmed by guilt and the realization that their secret could no longer be kept. Rachel's testimony would be crucial in the trial, but her own involvement ensured that she would not walk away unscathed. June 15, 2016 was the first day of Sarah's trial. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with anticipation. Reporters filled the benches, eager to capture every detail, while the townsfolk who had once attended Mass at St. Mary's now sat in judgment of the woman they had once admired. Sarah's children, too young to fully comprehend the gravity of the situation, were kept away from the proceedings, sheltered from the prying eyes of the public. The prosecution painted a damning picture of Sarah as a woman driven by lust and desperation, willing to do anything to protect her secret. They described the affair in vivid detail, the stolen moments, the lies, the betrayal. They argued that when David discovered the affair, Sarah had conspired with him to kill Father Donovan and cover up the crime, a theory supported by the evidence of her involvement in disposing of the body. The defense, on the other hand, portrayed Sarah as a victim of circumstances, a woman trapped in a loveless marriage who had made a terrible mistake. They argued that while she had indeed been involved in the affair, she had no knowledge of David's intentions and had acted out of fear and panic after the murder was committed. They called Rachel to the stand, who tearfully recounted the events of that night, insisting that Sarah had been as shocked as she was by Father Donovan's death. The trial stretched on for weeks, each day more grueling than the last. The media dissected every moment, turning the courtroom drama into a spectacle that gripped the nation. But as the trial neared its end, one question remained unanswered. Where was David Mitchell? On July the 10th, 2016, the trial was abruptly interrupted by a stunning development. David Mitchell had been found. Acting on a tip from a small town in rural Montana, authorities had tracked him to a remote cabin where he had been hiding out under an assumed identity. He was arrested without incident, a shell of the man he once was, gaunt and hollow-eyed from months on the run. David's arrest added a new layer of complexity to the case. Now that he was in custody, he would face trial for the murder of Father Donovan, and his testimony could either corroborate Sarah's version of events or seal her fate. The prosecution quickly moved to add his charges to the ongoing trial, merging the cases in a dramatic twist that kept the nation on edge. When David was finally brought to the stand, the courtroom fell silent. The man who had once been a respected businessman now stood accused of murder, his future hanging in the balance. His testimony was both shocking and heartbreaking. He admitted to killing Father Donovan in a fit of rage after discovering the affair, but he insisted that Sarah had no part in the planning or execution of the crime. He described how he had lost control, how the sight of his wife with another man had driven him to the brink, and how, in the aftermath, he had fled in terror, leaving Sarah to deal with the consequences of his actions. David's confession was a turning point in the trial. While it did little to absolve Sarah of her role in the cover-up, It cast doubt on the prosecution's theory that she had been a willing participant in the murder itself. The jury was left to grapple with the complexities of the case, the tangled web of lies and half-truths that had brought them all to this point. On August 5, 2016, the jury reached a verdict. Sarah Mitchell was found guilty of being an accessory to murder, her involvement in the cover-up undeniable. However, she was acquitted of the more serious charge of conspiracy to commit murder, the jury swayed by David's testimony that she had not been involved in the actual killing. She was sentenced to 10 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 6 years. David Mitchell, on the other hand, was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 25 years to life. His once promising career, his marriage, and his life as he had known it were all destroyed by that one moment of uncontrollable rage. Rachel, who had cooperated fully with the authorities and testified against both Sarah and David, was given a reduced sentence of 2 years probation, her role in the crime viewed as a tragic mistake made in the heat of the moment. As the dust settled, the town of Westbridge was left to pick up the pieces. St. Mary's Church, once the heart of the community, struggled to recover from the scandal. The congregation dwindled, the memory of Father Donovan's affair and murder casting a long shadow over the church's once sterling reputation. The Mitchell children were sent to live with relatives out of state, their lives forever altered by the choices of their parents. Sarah, now a prisoner, spent her days reflecting on the choices that had led her to this point. The love she had felt for Father Donovan seemed distant, almost unreal, a fever dream that had spiraled out of control. The guilt of what had happened haunted her, but there was also a small part of her that felt a sense of relief that the truth had finally come out. The burden of the secret she had carried for so long had been lifted, but at a cost that she would pay for the rest of her life. David, too, grappled with the weight of his actions. Alone in his cell, he replayed the night of the murder over and over in his mind, unable to escape the image of Father Donovan's blood on his hands. He knew that he would spend the rest of his life paying for what he had done, but there was also a part of him that longed for redemption, for some way to atone for the sins that had destroyed so many lives. The story of the Catholic priest's illicit affair with a married woman and the murder that followed would be told and retold in Westbridge for years to come. A cautionary tale of love, betrayal, and the dark consequences of unchecked desire. And as the town slowly began to heal, the name of Father Samuel Donovan would forever be remembered, not for the good he had done, but for the tragedy that had brought an end to his life and shattered the lives of those around him. True Crime Case Resolution would continue to document stories like this, stories that delve into the darkest corners of human nature, where love